learn Japanese history.
We are your navigators, Taro and Hanako.
Welcome, everyone. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating period, the Taisho era, which kicks off in 1912.
That's right. It begins right as the long Meiji era closes, with Emperor Meiji's passing and his son, Crown Prince Yoshihito, ascending the throne.
In the era name itself, Taisho, it comes from the I Ching, I understand, symbolizing something about just rule based on the people's will.
Exactly. Great righteousness, essentially. It hints at this idea of the emperor's legitimacy coming from governing well for the people. And interestingly, adopting this name went much more smoothly than the Meiji name change did.
Maybe a sign of the times already changing.
Could be. And that's really what this deep dive is about, not just the new emperor, but the huge political shifts and, well, the growing role of ordinary people during Taisho.
So it's a move away from the, let's say, the more controlled environment of late Meiji.
Definitely. We're going to explore how things went from that relative stability into a period of much more dynamic, sometimes quite turbulent political action and public involvement.
Okay, so where do we start? You mentioned stability. The Qin era.
Yeah, the Qin era. It describes that period, kind of late Meiji spilling into early Taisho, where power seemed to just alternate pretty predictably between two main figures.
Right, that was Katsura Taro. He represented the older guard, the establishment figures.
Sort of, yeah. The bureaucrats, the military interests, the genro perhaps lurking behind, and then there was Saionji Kinmochi.
And he was the leader of the Seiyukai party, the biggest party in the House of Representatives at the time.
Exactly. So you had this kind of seesaw effect. Katsura, then Saionji, then Katsura again. It looked stable on the surface.
But that stability was maybe a bit fragile.
Very fragile, as it turned out. The breaking point came in 1912. The second Saionji cabinet resigned.
Why was that?
It fundamentally came down to the army. The military leadership demanded funding for 2 new army divisions. But Saionji's cabinet, looking at the finances, said no, they couldn't justify the expense. This standoff revealed a really core tension.
The civilian government versus the military brass.
Precisely. And Saionji's refusal led to his government falling.
Which then opened the door for Katsura again, his third cabinet.
Yes, the third Katsura cabinet. And this is where things really start to heat up politically.
Because his return wasn't exactly welcomed by everyone.
Not at all. Key political figures, people like Inukai Tsuyoshi from the Rikken Kokuminto party and Ozaki Yukio of Saionji's Seiyukai, they saw this differently.
How so?
They, along with much of the press, viewed Katsura's comeback as, well, the old guard, the domain cliques, the military basically overriding the political process, an undemocratic move.
Right, and this feeling sparked something bigger.
It absolutely did. It fueled what's called the first movement to protect the Constitution, or the first Kensei Yugo Undu.
And they had that very powerful slogan.
Down with the domain clique, protect constitutional government. It was a direct challenge to these unelected, behind-the-scenes power players, the so-called domain clique powerful figures, often hailing from the domains that led the Meiji Restoration.
So people felt these established elites still had too much sway, hindering proper constitutional parliamentary government.
Exactly. And this movement was significant because it really showed, maybe for the first time on this scale, that public opinion could actually force change at the top.
So what happened? Did the movement work?
Well, the public reaction was strong. There were demonstrations, real pressure to get Katsura out.
Did he try to consolidate power?
He did. He actually tried to counter the movement by forming his own political party. It eventually became the Rikken Doshikai, hoping to build a base within the Diet.
Clever, but...
But it wasn't enough. The public pressure, the political opposition, it was just too much. He was forced to resign. And this whole sequence of events became known as the Taisho political change.
And you mentioned public demonstrations. How visible was this popular anger?
Incredibly visible. In 1913, you had large crowds actually surrounding the Diet building in Tokyo. It was a very clear, very physical demonstration of this growing political awareness and, frankly, willingness to act.
Wow. Just people showing up in force.
Yes. And it wasn't all peaceful protest, unfortunately. Some protesters targeted things they saw as symbols of the government newspapers considered pro-Katsura, local police boxes. There were clashes.
So a real sense of unrest. It shows people weren't just passive bystanders anymore.
Not at all. They felt they had a stake, and they were making their voices heard, sometimes quite forcefully.
So after Katsura's fall, who took over?
The next cabinet was led by Yamamoto Ganeshis, an admiral actually, but he had the backing of the Seiyukai party.
And he brought in some reforms.
He did. One quite significant one was abolishing the rule that the Army and Navy ministers had to be active duty generals or admirals.
This seems like a direct attempt to curb military influence in the cabinet, right? Allowing civilians potentially.
That was definitely the idea. A step towards more civilian control over the military, at least within the cabinet structure. But Yamamoto's time was also quite short-lived.
Oh, what happened there?
A major scandal blew up in 1914, the Siemens scandal.
Siemens, the German company.
That's the one. Allegations surfaced that high-ranking Japanese naval officials had taken bribes from Siemens, and possibly other foreign firms too, related to contracts for warships and equipment.
Corruption in the Navy.
Yeah.
That must have caused outrage.
Huge outrage. It completely undermined Yamamoto's government, especially given his own naval background. The public outcry was intense.
Leading to
The collapse of the Yamamoto cabinet, and that paved the way for the second Shigoma Shigenobu cabinet.
Shigenobu. Yeah. He was a popular figure, wasn't he? An elder statesman, but seen as more progressive.
Yes, he had considerable public support and was generally well regarded by the press at that time. His cabinet was backed by Katsura's old party, now the Rikken Doshikai.
So we see this cycle. Public pressure, scandal, cabinet collapse, new alignment. It really highlights what you said earlier.
Exactly. This constant flux, driven by party politics, public opinion, scandals, it all points to this more dynamic, more participatory, but also more unstable political landscape of the Taisho era. The parties were getting stronger, and the public voice mattered more.
And this public voice wasn't just influencing cabinet changes. You mentioned urban mass movements.
Right. This wasn't just about politicians maneuvering in the Diet. There's real energy, sometimes anger, spilling onto the streets.
We saw hints of this earlier, like the Hibiya incendiary incident after the Russo-Japanese War.
That was definitely a precursor, yes. That protest against the peace treaty term showed the potential for large-scale public unrest in the cities.
And the movement against Katsura in 1913 fits this pattern too.
Absolutely. The crowds around the Diet building were a clear example of this Taisho-era urban mass mobilization.
And even when the parties shifted, like with the Siemens scandal bringing down Yamamoto, the public was still out there.
Yes, there was significant public unrest demanding Yamamoto's resignation, too. It shows that dissatisfaction wasn't just about which clique or party was in power, but perhaps deeper issues about governance, corruption, and maybe economic hardship, too.
Who were these people in the crowds, typically?
Well, a large component seems to have been, lower-class urban dwellers, people who didn't have the right to vote, who weren't part of formal political groups.
So maybe feeling excluded from the system.
Very likely. And they were often mobilized by factions opposed to the government of the day, whoever that might be. Sometimes students or intellectuals got involved too, but the sheer numbers often came from these disenfranchised groups.
Did these movements have lasting organization?
That was often the weakness. They could flare up powerfully, like we saw, and definitely influence events in the short term, but they often lacked permanent structures to channel that energy into sustained political power.
Which presented a challenge for the political leaders, I imagine.
A huge challenge. How do you deal with this? How do you understand this popular energy, maybe even harness it without it constantly destabilizing the system? That was a key question for Taisho politics.
Okay, so alongside these street-level movements, there's also an intellectual shift happening. You mentioned Minpon Shugi?
Yes, Minpon Shugi, it's often translated as democracy or populism, but it's a bit nuanced.
Right. So can you unpack that for us? What did it really mean in the Taisho context?
Well, the background is partly global. World War I was being framed, especially by the Allies, as this fight between democracy and autocracy. That international climate had an influence in Japan.
Makes sense.
And the key figure promoting Minpon Shugi was Yoshino Sakuzus, a professor at Tokyo Imperial University.
What was his main argument?
His core idea was that political administration, government policy, should be based on the will of the people Minpon, the people as the base. The ultimate goal should be the welfare and happiness of the populace.
So government for the people, based on the people's general will, even if not directly by the people in the sense of universal suffrage yet.
That's a good way to put it. It wasn't necessarily a call to abolish the emperor system, but rather an argument for how government should function within that system. It strongly emphasized parliamentary politics, the Diet, as the place where the people's will should be expressed and enacted.
And this idea caught on.
It gained wide support, particularly among intellectuals, students, journalists. It provided a powerful language and ideology to criticize the existing power structures.
Like the Genro, The domain cliques, the military.
Exactly. Anyone seen as standing in the way of government reflecting the popular will could be criticized through the lens of Minpon. It really contributed to this overall atmosphere, this feeling of change that we call Taisho democracy.
Okay, now, while all this political ferment is happening, World War I is raging in Europe. And you mentioned earlier it had a big economic impact on Japan.
Oh, enormous. Japan experienced a major economic boom during the war years.
How did that work?
Well, basically, European powers were busy fighting. Their exports to Asia dried up, so Japanese industries stepped in to fill the gap.
Opportunity knocks.
Right. Things like cotton yarn, textiles. Japanese goods started dominating East Asian markets. Plus, the U.S. economy was doing well, and they bought a lot more Japanese silk.
So exports were surging.
Massively. And it wasn't just textiles. The demand for ships globally went through the roof because of the war.
Right, transporting troops, supplies.
Exactly. So Japan's shipbuilding and shipping industries just exploded. This is when you get the phenomenon of the Narakin.
The newly rich.
Yeah.
People making fortunes overnight in shipping.
Pretty much. Even smaller companies got in on the act. Japan actually became the world's third largest shipbuilding nation, just behind the U.S. and Britain.
That's incredible growth.
Yeah.
Any other areas?
Yes. There was progress in developing domestic industries, too, making pharmaceuticals, chemical fertilizers, things Japan previously imported. The chemical industry really started to grow.
And power generation.
Big strides there, too. More hydroelectric power plants were built, leading to more electricity being available, which then helped electrify factories, making them more productive.
So the overall picture is?
Industrial production overtook agriculture for the first time. Exports boomed. Japan ran a huge trade surplus, meaning it was exporting much more than it was importing. It even started exporting capital, investing in places like China, especially after the war, building factories there for cheaper labor.
Sounds like a golden age, economically speaking. But was life actually getting better for the average person?
That's the crucial question. And the answer is not necessarily.
How come, with all this growth?
Because alongside the boom came serious inflation. Prices were rising rapidly. We have data showing commodity prices basically tripled in just a few years.
Wow, tripled. So even if wages went up a bit.
Exactly. For many ordinary workers, any wage gains were eaten up, or more than eaten up, by the rising cost of living. Life remained pretty tough for the lower classes. It highlights that disconnect between national economic indicators and the lived reality for many people.
And this economic pressure, especially the cost of essentials, that leads us somewhere specific, doesn't it?
It leads us directly to the rice riots of 1918, one of the most dramatic events of the entire era.
Caused by the price of rice skyrocketing.
Precisely. Rice was the absolute staple food. By 1918, its price had surged so high, it was causing genuine hardship, even desperation, particularly among the poor.
Where did the riots start?
It began quite spontaneously, it seems, in the summer of 1918, in a small fishing village in Toyama Prefecture on the coast of the Sea of Japan.
And who started it?
It was initially housewives, women protesting the exorbitant price of rice, demanding that merchants sell it at a fair price or stop shipping it out of the prefecture where it might fetch higher prices elsewhere.
Just local housewives taking a stand.
Yes, but it tapped into this widespread anger and frustration. News spread incredibly fast.
And it wasn't just Toyama for long.
Not at all. Within days, similar protests, disturbances, riots erupted across the entire country. Major cities, smaller towns. It became a nationwide phenomenon.
What were people doing? What did the riots look like?
Crowds attacked rice merchants, dealers, shops perceived to be hoarding rice or profiteering. Sometimes they attacked the homes of wealthy individuals, too. It was a very direct expression of anger against perceived economic injustice.
How did the government respond? This was under the Toroshi Masatake cabinet, right?
Yes, Toroshi was prime minister. The government tried a couple of things, releasing some government rice stocks to try and lower prices, urging temperance. But primarily, they responded with force.
Meaning?
They deployed the military. Soldiers were sent into cities and towns across Japan to quell the unrest. There were clashes, arrests. It got quite serious.
So the army being used against the population over the price of food.
That's what it amounted to. Newspaper reports from the time, you can find translations, they paint a vivid picture. The women's determination in Toyama, the confrontations, the troops moving in, it was intense.
What was the political fallout?
The riots led to widespread criticism of the Toroshi government's handling of the economy and the unrest itself. They were seen as out of touch, ineffective, and ultimately repressive. The political damage was immense.
Did the cabinet survive?
No. The pressure became too great. The Tarochi cabinet resigned in the aftermath of the rice riots. It was a stark demonstration of how social unrest, fueled by economic conditions, could bring down a government.
So let's try to pull these threads together. Looking back at the Taisho era through this deep dive, it really was a period of profound change.
Absolutely. You see the shift in politics, the rise and fall of cabinets driven partly by public opinion and party maneuvering. You see the emergence of these mass movements, people taking to the streets.
And new ideas like Minpan Shugi gaining ground,
Yeah.
challenging the old ways of thinking about government.
Right. And all this happening against the backdrop of major economic shifts, the wartime boom, but also the inflation and hardship that led to things like the rice riots.
It feels like the defining characteristic is this increased presence, this increased voice of the general populace, a definite move away from the more top-down Meiji state.
I think that's fair to say. The political consciousness, the level of activism, it was clearly on the rise. People were demanding more involvement, challenging established power in ways that were quite new.
It really sets the stage, doesn't it? It makes you think about how these experiences, the push for more democracy, the reality of social unrest, the struggles over economic fairness, how all that shaped Japan heading into the later Taisho and early Showa periods. What kind of long-term impact did this early taste of mass politics have?
That's the crucial question to ponder, isn't it? It certainly laid some complex groundwork for the decades that followed.